If you've been in UX for more than 5 years, you've probably asked yourself this question recently. Am I watching my profession evolve or am I watching it get disrupted? Today, we're getting answers from someone who's lived through every major technology shift in our field.
It's just so natural, right? Like it's such a natural way to build. It's like the best pair programming or pair designing that you can have.
I'm joined by Adam Howell, a designer who's been building through change since before UX was even a common term. Adam started at JotSpot in 2005, one of the leading Web 2.0 startups that Google acquired to create Google Slides. At Google, he worked on Gmail and Google presentations during the AJAX revolution. But Adam didn't just ride the waves, he helped create them. He co-founded Mocksup, one of the first web apps for prototyping, which InVision acquired. In 2021, he launched Accomplice, one of the very first generative AI apps before Midjourney, before DALL-E 2. Currently, he's principal product manager for AI at Versapay, developing intelligent B2B payment solutions. In this conversation, you'll discover why 2005 UX barely resembled what we call UX today, and what that means for AI anxiety. The real difference between past disruptions and the AI moment from someone who built one of the first generative AI apps. Which UX skills have proven resilient across 20 years of tech shifts? Why junior UXers might actually be in a better position than junior developers in the AI era. Adam's prediction for what UX tools look like in an AI-first world and why he's optimistic. Let's dive into our conversation. Adam, welcome to UX Evolved. Adam, welcome. It's been a long time coming. We've known each other for a long time, and welcome to UX Evolved.
Thanks for having me.
I actually want to start with a time machine question. I want to take the Wayback Machine with you. And I want to take...
It's a ways back. Does it go that far back?
It goes back far. Unfortunately, I have to say far for both of us, but let's go back to 2005. If you can remember 2005, when you joined JotSpot, actually. And I want you to explain to me what user experience design was back in 2005. What did it mean then? If it even was a term, what did it mean? And how were we looking at ourselves in 2005 as designers?
Yep. It's a great question because I think the answer is it wasn't fully formed yet. I started freelancing with JotSpot in 2005. I was still working my day job, and they reached out because I had a website event that I ran called CSS Reboot and a blog, and they found me through that stuff. And they were doing a big design-focused redevelopment of the platform. So JotSpot at the time, you can think of it as the earliest Google Docs and Google Spreadsheets, basically. JotSpot was originally made to be like an internal wiki that you could add apps to. They had a very clunky web app that was built by developers, and they realized that an inflection point was coming, which was AJAX and the ability to make JavaScript calls asynchronously to the browser or in the background of the browser without having to have a page refresh. And they wanted to bring that experience to the new version, but they also wanted to make it actually usable and break away a little bit from the wiki constraints. And so they brought on a team to do that. I was a front-end designer / developer. They brought in a crack team of several designers. We had a team of 3 or 4 designers, and we just went soup to nuts and redesigned the entire interface, which at the time was relatively easy because it was still a relatively small app. But all the things that you use Google Docs and spreadsheets for now were represented some way in that redesign.
I want to hit on that you called yourself a designer front-end developer, and probably in a world where that was not very common. And then you were interfacing with other kind of, call them pure play UX designers. What was that like back then? How were you perceived?
Yep. I was very lucky in college studying computer science as a major, but I had a professor who he probably was one of the first people in academia to know what CSS was. And so he talked about CSS all the time, even when it wasn't relevant, because he was excited and he understood how difficult it was to make a widespread design changes on a website. And he saw this and he was smart enough to say, hey, this has a lot of promise. And so I learned how to write and use CSS very early for the time, which is crazy to say it now. But that made me pretty useful in walking that line, which I've always done throughout my career of design and development. And it was front end development was very different then. That was literally just using divs instead of tables and knowing how font size worked and how to make a global style sheet. Like that made you stand out.
Yeah, I was going to say, how did that work relative to those who were designing? What tools might they be using? Actually, I'm more interested in the interplay between you who knew design, but also knew front-end development, and those who knew perhaps graphic design really well or were good athletes in that space. What was working in 2005 in that kind of environment?
It was a lot of Illustrator and Photoshop, and it was emailing those things back and forth, which is what we'll talk about it later, but was eventually what led me to start Mocksup, because I saw that firsthand, just as we all did before InVision came, the idea of prototyping. Like it was a designer who was very comfortable with Illustrator, a designer, his name is Joseph Wayne. We still are friends, and he did Glyphish after JotSpot, which was one of the first mobile iOS icon libraries, and it really took off. You've used all of those icons on the bottom row of your iPhone. So Joseph was the really pixel perfect design-minded designer who did the JotSpot logo, and he really infused color in it, which at the time was one of the things that kind of set JotSpot apart was its playfulness and it's willing to be colorful and well designed. We worked really hard to make sure, hey, we want this to be one of the best looking web apps around, especially that is this interactive. And the story goes before we got the design totally cemented for V2, when they started learning how to inject AJAX into the original application, I think they supposedly did a presentation at a JavaScript conference and they got a standing ovation because they were one of the first web apps to show like really impressive AJAX usage. So people were excited to see the future. They were excited to have web apps instead of having to go and use Word and Excel.
Right. All right. So you've got consolidation on your mind. Now we're moving ahead. You've had a stint at Google. We're starting to hear words like AJAX and Web 2.0, and we're feeling this move towards perhaps a more nascent UX as documentarian wireframes to actually going in and becoming more product designers where you're building applications through powerful JavaScript evolution. At that time, could you feel it? Did you see that, oh, this is going to, much like we're sensing today in the world of AI, which we'll talk about later, but did it change the nature of what a UXer did when this kind of Web 2.0 evolution really started taking off at places like Google and eventually Mocksup, which we'll talk about?
With Google, I definitely think that Google felt it because JotSpot got bought in 2006. At the same time that it was partly an acqui-hire. We weren't really making any money. But the founders were original founders of Excite, the search engine, Graham, Norton, and Joe Kraus. And they knew search engines a little bit. They had already built a reasonably successful second thing. And Google was looking that wrap up that you mentioned. They saw the next several years and they saw what was coming with web apps. The executives certainly saw it and they said, okay, we need to buy the building blocks for what is now Google Workspace. And so they bought JotSpot. They bought Rightly. A lot of my career has been making like as easy to use things that are pretty visual as possible. But with Google Sites, as far as the UX part of it, that was the first time that I did user testing, which I think is a pretty interesting turning point in the profession, period. Because before it was all greenfield, right? Like we didn't know what we were doing. We didn't have time necessarily to user test. It was all broken and it was the first of its kind anyway. So just get it out there and see what happens after the .com crash. So the first user test of Google Sites was a train wreck because it was the first time we'd ever done it. We never did that with JotSpot. And I think that's where you start to really become the user experience professional, where you're having to just sit there and take it, right? And learn how to talk to customers, learn what they really need, and put your preconceptions away It's not just the fun side project stuff, right? It can potentially be hard work because you're having to take a whole bunch of data points and put aside your preconceptions to make something that is not just beautiful, but usable.
Yeah, tell me more about that. You've hit on really something that is hard for me to wrap my brain around. AI eliminating in the near term, I guess you
Right,
could say.
right.
One of the things that I think is the most intriguing about UX, which is that humanistic, scientific method aspect of what are we trying to do for whom, under what circumstances, and where does value lie? And even Google in the mid to late aughts, who wanted very little to do with things like design consistency and design systems, sounds to me like you're saying did hit on that research is a good thing to do, even if it's post hoc after we get something out and learn from it.
I think a lot of really strong product designers actually came out of that time at Google. If you've ever read the Design Sprint book by Jake Knapp, he and I worked together. He was one of the original Google product designers, and they learned a ton by helping teams like sites go through design sprints and kind of figure out what that even was, right? Like, he wrote the book on it literally because they had the time and the funding and the executive buy-in to say, hey, this is really important. And I think those early user tests that they did certainly showed when they were starting to build more complex things. I don't think they did it with Gmail in the beginning, but with Google Maps, I believe they did it much earlier on as far as, hey, this is a really big, confusing web app. Let's make sure that people can actually use it. When it does a lot of things, let's test all those things, right? With Google presentations, it was pretty funny, actually, because, and I'm going to come back and talk about designers at Google too, because there's an interesting thing about that too, I think. But the Google presentations, it was a developer's 20% project. I think it was one of the Docs developers, and he wanted to make a PowerPoint competitor, but he wanted to rethink the thing from the ground up. And so he made Google Slides in the beginning, but the first version was just one long page, and you put HRs in between the slides, right? And so to make it a smart system. And there's several slide things, especially with Markdown these days, that do that now. But in 2006 or 2007, when we put that in front of regular people, they were like, I have no idea what I'm doing. And so that's when they had to decide between that power user, that developer only experience, or make it into what we see today, which is eventually what they did. It felt really hard not to make thumbnails on the left-hand side because that was PowerPoint's land, and they didn't want to just be aping it. But eventually they realized there's a reason that it looks like that, and that's because that's what it has to do.
So then take it back. Tell me about UX at Google.
So this was the time of the design blog and web standards, and Jeffrey Zeldman and Doug Bowman had recently just started at Google because he had done some contracting there, I think, with a couple of projects, and he started eventually full-time to kind of lead this UX design role and to lead the team in a way. And when we had lunch in one of his first days, he was like, I don't think many designers want to be here. I'm having a hard time finding designers who want to work here. And I thought that was really interesting because it felt all the promise in the world for being able to work on anything. And I think where he was coming from was a world of, he had worked at Wired on websites and very design heavy experiences, like some of those really early web standards projects. And the idea of designing software, I think, was still pretty new to a lot of designers because product designer was not necessarily a named profession yet. And certainly, I don't necessarily think user experience was at the time either. And so it was interesting. It's interesting thinking back on that and seeing design from this pure standpoint of being able to design really pretty things that I want versus this huge corporation that is designing things that are new and amazing in their own right, but it's not necessarily from the design lens. It was more from the developer and product lens. So learning I think there's probably been a half dozen Gmail redesigns. There were probably a half dozen just in my couple of years there at Google, but that's a really good representation of the push and pull, right? Hey, yes, we know that Gmail could look better. And there were some beautiful, I think Doug redesigned Gmail from scratch and it looked amazing. But that's where it runs up against the business, right? Which is, I think, part of the user experience role too, is knowing what is too much necessarily to be valid and doable. And redesigning Gmail just from the standpoint of making it look beautiful was never a thing that they were going to be able to pull the trigger on.
Tell me about that. Flash forward to take that use case and flash forward it to 2025 in an era where Claude codes of the world are really closing the gap between what's difficult and what can be done in a matter of minutes and hours. Do you think that sort of that mantra of let's get something out the door with as little user research or usability insight or user testing with as little as possible, just so we can learn now and fail fast. Is that still a good model when you know in the future you actually can bring in the user side and the technological capabilities with much faster revs? Does that change the
Right.
model, I guess is what I'm
I
asking
don't
you.
know. I think it depends on what you're building necessarily. If it's this greenfield thing that needs to start small, then I think you can get it out the door faster than ever, certainly, and validate it. Which for me, as someone who's not smart enough to like not make things that I use myself to see if they're good, that's always been really useful for me. I definitely need to eat my own dog food with everything. But then also, I think with the people who are worried about what it's going to do, the way I like to think about it currently, I'll zoom out from work for a second. And just one of the things that most has stuck with me in reading about AI lately is someone saying certainly 25% fewer white collar jobs is a number we've all heard lately. And it's a scary one, but this stuck with me. And the idea of, okay, but maybe we can have more adults in schools like tutoring kids, right? Or maybe we can all take more time to do the things that we don't have the time to do now because we will have more time on our hands. And I think about that with product design and user experience design too. I hope that it means that we'll see a little bit more personality maybe back in stuff, right? I think we maybe haven't necessarily had the time for as much personality as I feel like we did, like not necessarily clippy, but making things fun, remembering that this stuff can be fun again. I think if we have the time to put in some of those finishing details like we used to. I think a lot about how Mac OS X had that time when it first came out because they were so far ahead of Microsoft and everyone else. And so if everyone else can get that same improvement from AI, then I like to think the software will get a lot better and that maybe we'll have time to do the things that we always make the jokes about the executives not having time for design. Other than like still getting real people in front of your thing and talking to them about it, and people who are relevant to it, people who have experience with it and can actually find it useful, that's still going to be the hardest thing, and you're not going to be able to automate that away.
Yeah,
and the attempts to automate that away by having user testing.ai or something where you're going to make a bunch of agents who are going through your thing, I don't think we're there yet.
No, I'm not quite there yet. I do love your comment about maybe it actually gives us the time back rather than looking at that as idle or looking at that as unemployment or recessionary. It's actually almost a recycling of the time to actually take a moment and go, that just means more revs, or that just means more injection into that minimum lovable product. So it's more lovable than it is just purely viable.
Or time to just bang on it some more, right? Like I get so much of my value about when a thing works by just trying it and using it. And so if we can get to GA or to code freeze faster, then maybe we can increase some of the time where everyone can bang on a thing or you can show it off to more people before you launch it.
Tell me about that. So that's a great segue, actually. You actually co-founded a company called Mocksup, which kind of was meant to do things like that, which I believe InVision acquired, looking at things from a workflow perspective and trying to get it as real to life as possible before making a commitment, whether it's an investment or it's a redesign. Look back at that and tell me more about those.
Yeah, 100%.
Did it do what it was intended to do, or was it actually too early? It almost needed AI in order for it to be real to life.
We had this problem at work. I had started using this guy's early prototype and it broke all the time and whatnot. So I said, hey, let's make a good version of this that we can use at work because we were doing a redesign. And so the idea being you upload your mockups and you can create hot links on the buttons and the links in the mockup
Right.
to jump you back and forth. And it's really easy to draw the box around the link. It saves it there. You hold shift and you click on it. You go to the next one. You can very easily prototype a whole working website or app. And it worked really well. So I tried to keep it going. But eventually we sold it for a very small amount to InVision, and they took the users and offered them InVision. And then now, of course, InVision isn't around anymore. But it goes back to the idea of the growing user experience professional career, right? I felt like it was a needed tool in the tool belt that didn't really exist yet.
Yeah.
Of, hey, here is a working prototype without having to build it. It could just be wireframes. It could just be, I don't think Balsamic existed at the time, but very definitely I've put a bunch of Balsamic wireframes into InVision. I used InVision up until the last day. I still wish it was still around because, like I said, I'm not smart enough to not use a thing and get my head around it. It needs to be visual for me. I need to experience it. I need to use it. I need to stop and think about how I used it. I need to wake up in the morning early one day and realize, oh, that's why that's been bothering me. I need to really marinate with the thing. And so I've made a lot of tools that have made that easier, and Mocksup was one of the better ones. And I think InVision saw the promise of that.
I suppose the argument could be made that while it accelerated our lives as designers, because you were able to picture, say, 1,000 words, obviously you're able to put an end-to-end flow in front of an executive or even in front of users to do some light conceptual testing.
Yeah, they haven't had their head in it as much as you have.
Saving cycles and
very
cycles
easy
of
user testing. Share the link out. Yep.
Now you fast forward and you're going, wait a minute, the amount of cycles needed to produce a thing are coming further and further.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this actually, because I think a Mocksup could make a comeback personally. Because you are accentuating the data of the screenshots. As we all know, more context is better for an LLM. And so I've dragged screenshots in the Claude code all day. I'm sure you have too. If you haven't, then you should, because it is your true working partner as far as being able to read the screenshot. Same with ChatGPT, of course. But if you could add, I circle stuff on the screenshot sometimes. And if you could, I see a day very soon where you drop a link in and you say, hey, like an OpenAI agent point of view where it's the web browser and it's clicking through. If you could have OpenAI agent click through your prototype and help you make a bunch of functional specs and PRDs based off of just it using your thing, then that is more context for it, because it is experiencing the thing. If you've used OpenAI agent, it very dumbly, that might be a true user experience session. Now that I think about it, it's not necessarily like getting user personas that are agents and telling you how they experience it. It's watching the thing actually try and click around. I had it try and do some stuff on Amazon Seller Central, which is Amazon's seller marketplace. It just gave up because it's such an old and clunky interface. So I see a time where it's Mocksup plus OpenAI agent, InVision plus OpenAI agent, where you can really watch the agent experience it and then have it give you a really useful rundown of that, and then translate that directly into the building of the software.
Yeah, I love that flow. Using Mocksup or a Mocksup / InVision as a generative starting point where the creativity still lies very heavily on the human side from a standpoint of understanding need, trying to concept value before you're really diving into the how, which is where, as we all know, is taking off on the AI side.
But of course, the question is, now, do you need that extra step, right? Because if you can drop a screenshot into Claude code and have it make you an HTML prototype powered by Tailwind, that is just maybe to start with some HTML pages that link together, and then you can have mobile and desktop view. Is that just as good? Which it's going to take longer potentially to do that for Claude code, but it might not be as long as it takes you to make the wireframes or the designs.
As we kind of ruminate on where AI fits and all of these points that we have, looking back 20 years, all had to do ourselves in relatively manual ways. If you go back to 2005, we're talking about Photoshop, we're talking about Illustrator. Certainly the tools started catching up to our needs as designers, but now it almost seems like the tools are so much faster than how we can even understand how we might even use them.
They're definitely going to get there, right? If you tried to make a mock-up with ChatGPT, it feels like it took a step back from a few months ago when it was spelling everything correctly. I think they probably had to cut down on some of the cycles to get those images out. So it's not doing it quite a comprehensive of a job. When this new model first came out, like that was really interesting, right? Oh, do we even need to design flyers anymore because the spelling is perfect? The spelling went back to being shit again. But we can see where we're going. We'll get back to that place that we were a few months ago again, once they buy more GPUs, I'm guessing. But yeah, like the conversational aspect of an AI co-pilot, not the branded one, but the concept, I think is going to be really powerful for designers going forward. And not just with this idea of like rubber ducking a solution by going back and forth, but it's just so natural, right? Like it's such a natural way to build. It's like the best pair programming or pair designing that you can have. And if we can figure out, if we can, what people who use Claude Code and feel like they really connect with it, feel like there's going to be a design tool that does that very soon. And SVG paths are very confusing, even for LLMs, it turns out. So it'll be interesting to see how we overcome that limitation with product design tools, but we will. And then if you can just sit and talk and build an entire design, like everyone that I talked to about AI recently, like I asked them this question, what does that mean for SaaS, right? What does that mean for the business that we've been doing for the last 20 plus years, ever since Basecamp 1.0 came out? How, and one of the analogies that I made the other day when I was talking to someone about this was it might very well be like the music industry and the movie industry, right? Where if anyone can make music now and get it very easily via Spotify, if software becomes that, then that will potentially devalue it, right? But also it might just mean that you don't need a 400-person team to make a relatively profitable piece of software. But going back to I think the original question, design tools and AI, and what does that mean for the user experience part of that? Again, I think it makes it, I think it democratizes it a little bit. I think design has been really democratized a lot in the last several years anyway. Like when you could invite an executive to Figma and they could come in and you could see their cursor while you were walking through something or see them move something around. Like that used to be a hell no from a designer, right? No, I'm not going to share my Photoshop file with you, client or boss. And I feel like we've gotten over that hump now because it has been democratized, right? Everyone uses these things every day. 20 years ago, there was a small subset of the population that used these things every day and knew how to actually build them and how they work. And now, especially if you can just talk to your LLM to help you build something, which I'm sure several people in your lives who've built a chore tool, or like they are so excited to finally be able to build apps. And this idea that you would hold that against people or be sad about that is interesting. Those certainly downsides, but it's just a tool, I think, that is further democratizing things. And the question just is, what does that mean for the long run of software? Like, it's going to change things.
Every week there's a new AI design tool, and it's not there. From a design standpoint, we're not, you can see
that one I sent you the other day was garbage. They basically just tried to make a thinking version of Midjourney, and you could tell that it was just a bunch of bull. It thinks and thinks and thinks, and then the last step it does in its reasoning chain is ChatGPT image.
We've talked about every week these AI tools come out, and it seems like there's a new one every week. And you and I both know that there's some pretty questionable ones out there. We're not going to name names on this podcast, but the pace feels relentless. Is the speed of change fundamentally different this time around? You compare it to like the mobile revolution of 07-ish, 08, or does it just feel that way because we're living through it?
I think that's a two-part answer. The first one is talking about the mobile revolution. I refused to get an iPhone at first mainly because I didn't want something that could bug me all day long. I didn't want, because I could tell that it was going to be a very addictive thing. I was trying to stay away from addictive things, and I tried to stay away from the iPhone as long as possible until my cousin got one and he brought it to a football game and he showed it to me. And I was like, okay, I got to have that. And as a designer who was very comfortable designing and developing websites, it definitely shook up, I think, my world and a lot of other people's world at the time of 2007, 2008, where we'd gotten very comfortable with kind of the progress that we were making, the progress of change of, okay, we got web standards, we're going to figure this out. We got web apps, we're going to figure this out. They need to be big and on a desktop, and you have your left-hand nav and all this real estate. And then when the iPhone came out, it was definitely like, that's a very small screen. You're never going to be able to fit all this stuff on there. And it's got to be an app. Everything's going to be web apps, right? Like when Steve Jobs came back to Apple in 97, right? I think that the realization of what an app experience could be, I think started with that big redesign of Mac and of OS 10. And I think we all tried to learn from what Apple was doing at the time as we brought it into web apps and through the 2000s. And then this notion of, hey, we're all going to want to have this stuff all with us all the time. And you need to learn how to design around that. And that was a really big change because it was a whole different toolkit and a whole different tool set and a whole different experience. And I think eventually the App Store, that felt like it was constrained though, right? Because we all know an iPhone developer who is still getting really paid really well today, right? They have not gone hungry for 15 plus years. I know one here in Charlotte who does great work, and he is perfectly happy just making really solid iPhone apps and has done it for almost 2 decades now, I think. And he's really good at it, and it'll always put food on his table. And I think the difference, though, there were never enough iPhone developers, and there were never enough ways to get your app used. So there was a ceiling with the effect,
Right.
other than the fact that we're all looking at our phones all day, every day. But that's not necessarily connected to UX design. But for the thing that might be different about AI is the fact that if we ever can have it truly learn, right? That's the big question now. We train now, and then we cut it off, and we can give it some context. We can save our ChatGPT settings. We can tell it our name and a bunch of things about us, and it can remember things about us. But that's all just the context window. We're not yet teaching it things. But we're also, I think ChatGPT 5 is going to come out next month, I believe, and we'll see if it's another leap or if it's just another kind of small step up. But if there's ever this time where, the AI can build the AI is the cliche, of course. But if that ever does happen, then it's only going to get even faster. But as far as the apps that use it and learn how to use it better, it's going to be just like mobile. We're going to learn the best places to put AI. I think every app is going to have some kind of interaction with it. I personally think that the thing I'm surprised that we haven't necessarily seen yet, and I think we'll see very soon, is a Rails or a React that is AI first. This idea of running Rails on a GPU and then being able to call a local AI model that can do a lot of the things that we call ChatGPT for now. Once those costs come down and it's not a fixed cost to add AI to your application, then that's where I think we'll start seeing AI build the application on the fly. And that's where I think one of the things that we talk about a lot now is the idea of the UI auto updating for you based off what you're doing. I think once we get to that AI first framework, we'll start seeing a lot of that, and that'll be really interesting. But as far as the pace of change goes, I don't think it's going to slow down. I think it already has slowed down a little bit, though. Like we've already talked about how ChatGPT, the new image model, got shitty over the last few months, and Anthropic's putting all their eggs in the Claude code basket because that's where the real product market fit is. So you're already seeing people have to make choices. So the growth is not endless, and they're all losing money on these things. So I do think that eventually we will see some kind of leveling out, and then we can all take a breath and realize where we are. And it'll be a lot like the .com crash probably and the Web 2.0 cycle when mobile came, of taking a step back, getting all the really best parts, and then maybe that's where that AI first framework comes for building the next thing, where we don't have to necessarily rely on the other companies as much.
It's a really good point that the critical few, the UXers who will actually thrive in this new world. And what are the qualities? I mean, you picture your prototypical awesome UXer who's really killing it in their role today, sans AI, and the qualities that you think actually they can take advantage of and accelerate. And then tell me a little bit about what are those responsibilities or skill sets that actually doesn't lend itself very well to a traditional UX, and that perhaps we in the field must upskill ourselves to retain our role, if you will, in the AI.
Yeah. I think it goes back a little bit to that get good at business statement of of not only knowing your customer, like actually really knowing your customer, knowing the in and out of the product, not like shirking that responsibility off to the tester or to the product manager, trying to fill in those gaps in your knowledge because it's going to make you understand the product better. But then also never being scared to really push on, hey, what are we trying to solve? As long as you're not just trying to delay like actually solving it by asking a bunch of questions, right? Asking questions that'll really get to the root of the problem that you're trying to solve and staying focused on that thing. And then probably going a little bit faster maybe than we had to back in the day, just pushing pixels around or designing for your resume, right? This idea of designing something for your peer group instead of designing something that's actually going to make a difference. I'm not sure that's going to fly as much anymore. You're going to have to actually really be able to show the problems that you solved. And so you're going to have to make sure to actually be solving real problems. And maybe tracking, like the product managers track KPIs for a launch, do that yourself too, so that you can point to those things with real numbers and show real results. And get this one of the, being good at presenting, being able to speak to what you built and anticipate the questions that might be asked about it. Talking to one extra customer before you call it for the day, or that difficult customer that you don't necessarily want to talk to and you hope that someone else talks to them first. It's pulling from a little bit. It might not be fair necessarily because you're having to say, hey, in the same way that it was learn how to code, so be more like a developer 5-10 years ago. Now no one's going to say that anymore because that's what Claude codes for. But there's going to be a thing that does that for designer. It's interesting, right? A junior developer might be in a worse spot now than a junior designer for the first time in a while, right?
I think that's why you said before, you think that perhaps junior UXers may be in a competitively speaking, market-wise position, in a better position than a pure play junior developer, taking no ill will towards the awesome up-and-coming developers, but that humanistic quotient is not something that can easily be solved by AI alone, at least not there.
Especially if they get good at designing for AI. So just in the same way that young designers learned mobile first and they could design an app, there's a lot of really amazing designers who are in their 30s now who have done things with games or with mobile apps that I can never do because that's what they grew up getting really good at. Same thing with desktop design and same thing with phone operators, right? The men and women who understood the phone system back in the 70s and 80s were the ones who built the first mobile phones because they weren't scared to know how the back end of the phone operates. And I think about that a lot when we're thinking about my daughter knows her mobile phone better than she knows her desktop, certainly. And there's going to be designers who are AI first and who know what works and what doesn't in a chat or in a proactive experience. One of the things I think we're going to see a lot more of is proactive AI and knowing when and how to do that. I think Clippy showed us all the starting point, the 0 on the scale of 0 to 100. And there's going to be a ton of user experience design and not annoying the user, not flattering the user. We've already seen the
sycophantic approach.
An experience failure on the part of ChatGPT. And so I think we're just going to have to change a little bit about what experience design means because the software is changing. It's not just clicking anymore. It is talking. Several of my friends don't even chat to ChatGPT anymore. They use, I think it's a Whisper or other voice to text tools. And they want that, I'm sure, very close to your heart, Star Trek experience of talking all day long. They use Claude Code that way. They use ChatGPT that way. And so how do you design that? Like our Tesla screens that is UX design. That is design in the real world because we broke out of the desktop and the mobile device and we designed kiosks and we designed arenas and stadiums and experiences and cars. And now we're going to be going into designing essentially the robots of the future, right? You're not going to necessarily need to know exactly how to use the Uber app soon. You'll just have your Uber robot, whatever it might be.
You're making me want to go back and do two things: reread The Design of Everyday Things and watch all of the Next Generation episodes where Geordie LaForge is interfacing with the ship's computer. because to me, those were some of the most fun. You almost wanted to see if he could trick it or actually not get the answer, because he used it as a tool to be able to arrive at a conclusion. And perhaps that's what design is going to be, is it's going to be geared less towards the how many hashes can we remove and more towards the what outcome are we actually trying to solve for here. So this is not just on the B2C side. You're the principal PM for AI at Versapay, a leading payments and accounts receivable software provider. So you're not just watching AI disrupt your UX. You're building specific AI first products in the B2B space. What are you seeing that the rest of us, with all your kind of on the ground experience in your past life and now up to now, what might you be seeing in the space that maybe we're just not seeing yet? What is the next thing that we're not, that's on the horizon, that's just not there?
I knew that in the next phase, I wanted to try and touch on something that was with a reasonably well-funded company, because I had already experienced getting washed out by VC money with Accomplice. And I think a small product can be a one-man shop in the world of AI, but you can't be trying to lead a charge as a one-man shop with AI. And I also wanted to do something that was more statistical and numbers-based and B2B, like you said, and stay away from B2C as much as possible. Because I think there's obviously a ton of opportunity there, but also B, that's also really interesting, right? How can we use both machine learning, which doesn't hallucinate, is that you train it on numbers and it learns only about the numbers, and then Gen AI, which could potentially hallucinate, but could still be really useful for something that could most likely be innovated more than most other things, which is accounts receivable software. So something that's very fundamental to every business, especially every large business who is getting thousands of invoices a month. How do you make it easier for them to get paid and to track their payments and to track their business? And that goes towards predicting cash flow. That goes towards, hey, here are the invoices this month that might be paid early. So this might be what you could see by the end of the month that you might not be anticipating. Hey, here's the person who is going to pay late, probably. So you may want to reach out to them a little bit earlier than you normally would, all the way down the line. And then eventually, I would like to see us at least do some prototypes in the coming months and years of, hey, what does a totally rethought AR experience look like? In between there, I think you'll be able to chat with your data, where you'll be able to maybe connect with your AI platform from your LLM of choice and say, hey, what are today's numbers looking like? Or who should I reach out to right now? I have a few minutes. So more conversational, more useful, but always secure and always extremely useful. That's a mantra that I try to repeat as much as possible.
Maybe maybe one of those for those who are in B2B UXers, or they look. You can almost look at B2C as your forward-looking, cutting edge, just as we saw with mobile, where those on the consumer side of iPhones, smartphones were not brought into the business world and applied against a B2B construct for many years after that, and took many cycles of digital revolution for that to happen, transformation. Maybe the same thing happens here, where AI in a ring-fenced environment, as you spoke of before, it's a fun place to be because you know where your boundary lines are. You can fight those hallucinations. You can be a UXer under constraints, and those constraints are business drivers. Whereas with B2C, I'm not sure we know where the constraints are right now. And I'm not sure that those in the largest of LLMs know where those constraints are.
And there's a ton of challenges too from the internal side too, right? Like, how can you use, and we have a Slack chat bot, as a lot of companies do now, but pump it in with your previous Slacks, with your FAQs, with your business knowledge, with your sales calls, to make it easier for people to find the information they need, because we are a remote only company, and there are new people coming in every week. And how do you make it as easy as possible for them to onboard? And that is a problem that AI can help you solve. And then going to all the way from design to development, like if every developer has Claude Code on their desktop, like how do we make sure that we're taking advantage of that? And how do you optimize it? And how do you keep people happy if they are used to doing it one way? And every company is talking about these same things, but it was one of the reasons that I wanted to join Versapay, is that it felt like it was in the right spot for a lot of these challenges to be able to act on them still.
You look at your role at Versapay and the UXers that you partner with there. What do you wish UX would be like 1 year from now at a B2B company like Versapay? And then what do you think it might be 5 years from now in terms of what they offer the company?
Yeah.
And what they offer their customers?
Yeah, I can guess short term, probably a little bit better. I think that a lot of user experience designers, I've talked about learning to code a lot already, but it's not just necessarily learning code. I think learning to prototype is still a very useful thing. That's one of the things that we founded at Google was we tried to make a prototyping practice. Obviously, Mocksup was clickable prototypes. And now with no excuse left necessarily to not try and see if you can make an experience that gets beyond the pixel and the Figma, I think that's a really interesting challenge.
Yeah.
And then using AI to maybe make it easier to do more research or more user interviews, or to take the results from that survey or that user interview and to coalesce it really nicely. And then I know presentation should look ugly. There's no excuse anymore. So just on the wholesale graphic design standpoint, like design can help a company look amazing all the time now. And I think that's something that should be seen as like a fun challenge too.
Yeah, we didn't hit on we didn't hit on visual much, although you did mention it when we were talking about Google and really the power of the medium as it got to know it. And of course now some of the gorgeousness that goes into things like color and Google Maps. But that's a really interesting point, that it isn't just about the platform, the product designer's platform that they're designing to. Anything and everything that they can put out now can have a level of just delight to it that asks almost nothing from them, marginally more to have this. And the level of, I've seen it myself from a stakeholder's perspective, the level of confidence goes way up, and the level of excitement and the feeling of consistency brings a level of energy and can-do spirit across all the divisions of the company.
Yeah. And I think it also touches on why a junior designer might be in a better spot than a junior developer, because I think making things that stand out is going to be really important as we maybe get noisier with the amount of new tools and software that comes out, because it's easier to launch it. And if everyone's just taking your long email and plopping it in ChatGPT anyway, and no one's reading anything, like being able to make something that is succinct, and whether it's a video or a slideshow that is easy to digest, like knowing how people actually learn information, I think is going to be really important too. Because at a 400-person remote first company, it can be hard to get people's attention sometimes. And so being able to design beautiful things that make an impact and can grab people's attention, or that just, like one of the things that at Google at the time I thought was silly, but they were ahead of their time. A lot of the designers, they created some of probably the first Loom video. Like they would record themselves walking through the prototype because they knew the executives didn't have any time. The VP didn't have time to look at whatever there was, but it was important they saw it. So they put their face in the bottom left of the video, and they spent the time to learn how to do that in a way that was digestible. And I thought, and that's a lot of effort to go to. I'm not even sure someone's going to look at it. But thinking that way now in a new paradigm is probably going to be really important, not just for getting your users' attention, but also internal.
Yeah, really insightful. All right, so finally, this is something I'm going to ask every guest, and you're my inaugural guest, so you get first dig at this. If you could redesign one thing in the universe, anything at all, what would it be?
I'll give a real world example, and that'd be the modern day plane ride. The modern day
it's a good
experience of flying in a plane. I'm not even that tall of a guy, but I am in my mid 40s. And as a 6'2" individual, my early days of flight versus today's days of flight, like I used to take red eyes and be able to lean back and go to sleep. And you couldn't do that in a modern day plane chair if your life depended on it. So going back to the swinging 60s and 70s days of airplane travel, or I guess being able to afford one of the lean back chairs,
Yeah, I think you just nailed it. It's not just the redesign physically, it's the redesigning of the economics of plane travel might be doing. Yeah.
But you talk about user experience design. And the second you buy the plane ticket, it is the infinite dings and nickels and dimes of the plane experience, from app to website to actual flight. At least all the flight attendants are still working hard and they do a great job. But other than that, the executives can stop.
With that, thank you very much, Adam, for your time.
Yeah, man.
This was
Thanks
really
for having me.
insightful. I'm looking forward to many more AI interactions with you, and I can't wait to see what you create.